But a question I'm asking is, why would the military feel any pressure at all to comply with the spoken rules created by the airplane police that have so far proven to be incredibly lenient? It seems to me that the military is flying how and where they want to because they can. Because despite the deaths of 67 people, there have been almost no additional requirements placed upon them in writing. So much of what we are hearing has been voluntary actions by a military that keeps proving itself incapable of policing itself in a way that puts our safety first.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 316th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is going to be about a plane crash, which I know had freaked me out when it happened. It probably freaked you out too. And the National Transportation Safety Board has given us some information about that plane crash. I am talking about the one that happened in Washington, D.C. in late January when a military helicopter crashed into a passenger jet and everyone died. Well, like I said, the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the part of our government that investigates transportation accidents, they have released their preliminary report about that midair crash. So today, even though the investigation isn't complete, because this is like the first draft of their investigation reports, but the information they've already discovered in this preliminary report is disturbing, and there are issues here that I think require some phone calls to Congress. And so, in order to let you hear the information for yourself, today I'm going to play you the highlights from 3 recent hearings. Actually, you're going to hear testimony for more than that because I have some old sound clips peppered in here where the witnesses now seem like they were testifying using crystal balls. But for the most part, I watched 3 hearings for you that took place here in 2025. And I took out all the boring and repetitive parts, and I'm giving you just the good stuff. And in between, I will make sure you understand all of the technical jargon that you are going to hear so that you can truly understand these conversations. And of course, because we spend a stupid amount of time making sure that we document everything we tell you, because you shouldn't have to trust us in this era of bullshittery, well, we have extensive show notes waiting for you on congressionaldish.com and in most of the podcast apps if you want to fact check anything that I say, or if you want to jump down this rabbit hole further. And just so you know, we do that for every episode. And if you appreciate that effort and support this podcast's continued existence, please pay directly whatever you think is fair, because we do not sell your time to advertisers here. You won't hear any ads. We get paid directly by you. And since it's been a while and I did recently get a question about our different payment methods, let's break down the different methods by fee, because there are some corporate middlemen that take some of your money when you give it to Congressional Dish for some of these methods. And to be honest, I'm not mad about that, but I know it's important to some people that every penny get to me. And so here's how that breaks down. If you want every penny to get to me and Congressional Dish, and you want that to happen quickly, Venmo is the way to go. That's the only instant option that we have that's truly free, at least for the moment. But it does take the most effort, as there is no auto pay option right now on Venmo. But I do love the Venmos because I love your notes and your emojis and the ding. Every time you send in a Venmo, I hear a ding, and it makes me happy every time I'm near my phone and I'm able to hear it in real time. Then the other truly free option, at least for us, is sending paper checks in the mail, which a surprisingly large percentage of our producers choose to do. Now, if you are writing your own checks and then sending them with a stamp, obviously there's a cost on your end because you have to pay for the check, the envelope, and the stamp. But you can get the bank to pay for all of that by sending the check through your bank. And when you do this, your bank, the big evil bankers, well, they pay for the physical paper that the check is printed on, and they pay for the stamp, which supports the U.S. Postal Service. And so I think sending bank printed checks is the most patriotic option that we have, with a huge bonus that no middleman takes a cut of your payments. It's also super easy to set up auto payments with bank checks to support the show on a continuing basis, which does allow us to have some regular funds to budget with because, as you can imagine, a donation-only funding model is quite a roller coaster ride. And so for all of those many reasons, we are huge fans of bank checks over here. But getting back to instant digital payments, the next least expensive option is Zelle. And Zelle payments are direct bank transfers from your bank to mine, and the fee is pretty low. And so Zelle is also a great option for auto payments. And then PayPal also makes setting it and forgetting it really easy if you want to support Congressional Dish on a continuing basis. But the fees are higher than Zelle, so Zelle beats PayPal in that competition. And then there's Cash App, and Cash App is raising their fees to match PayPal's fees, which is annoying because Cash App is annoying to use, and they charge me now to take my own money out of their system. And so if you love using Cash App, I'm obviously happy to take payments there, but if it doesn't matter to you, Zelle or PayPal are preferred. I also accept cryptocurrencies, which I still don't think are real money, but I do accept them, and I keep them, I hold them. And because you crypto nerds have put my skin in the game by giving me these damn things, I do pay attention to what's going on with cryptocurrencies in Congress, and you've even gotten me to produce at least one episode about them. So well played, nerds. But right now, I have wallets created for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin, and those are listed on the support page on congressionaldish.com. And then finally, there's Patreon. And Patreon takes the most fees by far. But Patreon also gives us a private feed, which allows me to produce Last Week in Congress just for Congressional Dish insiders. Last Week in Congress are bonus episodes during which I use the congressional record to tell you what Congress did last week. And as I'm producing them, I research it a little bit, but those episodes are not scripted at all. And I just feel much freer because I know the only people listening to it are people invested in the show. And so I feel much freer to tell you what I really think about things. Also, Patreon supporters don't hear these pitches for funding at all. They get cut out of the main episodes. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, Patreon is the method that most producers are using to support the show. And that's true by far. You know, high fees for Patreon, but also a high reward. But on my end, the truth is that I don't really care how you support the show as long as you do support the show. And all of these options are linked for you in the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com, and they're listed on every episode's show notes. And so, now that you know all that, let's get to the actual show. Now, most of this episode is going to be about the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation into the January 29th crash. But I can't pretend that aviation industry problems haven't been front page news for the last 2 weeks. And so before we get started with the January 29th crash investigation, let's talk real quick about the air traffic controller communications outages at Newark and Denver. Because on April 28th and again on May 9th, radar screens at Newark Airport went dark for approximately 90 seconds each time, freaking out air controllers to the point that they had to take some time off of work, causing all kinds of delays at Newark, but also freaking out everyone who flies on airplanes in the United States. And so the obvious question is, how did this happen? Well, there was a hearing in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on May 14th, during which the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the Federal Aviation Administration's Air Traffic Control Organization, Frank McIntosh, testified. And so here's his exchange with Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
Newark International Airport has been beset by delays after the radar system malfunctioned, leaving controllers unable to see or communicate with aircraft in their sector for approximately 90 seconds. What broke down, and how did the system become this deteriorated in the first place?
Thank you, Senator. To answer your question, we were obviously very concerned about the disruptions that occurred in Newark airspace as well for the 90 seconds that it occurred. When we did our investigation, what we found out was our telecommunication provider that provides network lines into that area. There's two lines, Senator, that provide data and transmission feeds. The primary line that came in failed. We have a secondary redundant line that provides the radar transmissions and our voice capabilities, and that redundant line is supposed to assume that load. And it's supposed to be instantaneous, where if we were to have a fiber cut of a line or a copper cut of a line, something along those regards, then that redundant line is supposed to kick in. When we lost that first line, the second line did not kick in like it was designed to do. That's what caused the disruption. The disruption was for 90 seconds. The aircraft, I'm an air traffic controller by trade, so I'm just going to talk like an air traffic controller if that's okay. Air traffic controllers provide positive separation between aircraft. That is what we do. And what I mean by that is we never point aircraft head on at the same altitude. We ensure we have appropriate levels of separation. In the event that we have something like a Nordo aircraft that has a stuck mic that could jam up the frequencies, or if we have something like that. So we didn't have a loss of separation based on some of our procedures that we have installed and the techniques that we use as controllers. I do want to highlight that. But 90 seconds is a long time for an air traffic controller. So although we have contingencies in place that we use to make sure that we keep aircraft safe, it is a long disruption for a radar screen to go blank or not to be able to talk to aircraft. So that was something that we wanted to take a look at, and we have put in corrective measures since that happened to ensure that those redundancies are better for that airspace. We have this system across the United States feeding radar data like this, where we have a line and a redundant line, and we haven't had a failure like this to this degree in my memory. So we had to put together, along with the local vendor that was responsible for the telecommunications, to provide a more resistant or a better contingency to ensure that if it ever happened again, that we feel good about those processes. We were able to implement a new contingency, and we are working with a telco provider, along with Secretary Duffy's leadership, to actually bring in a third line of redundancy into that area to prevent this from happening again.
So that didn't quite explain to me why the backup didn't kick in, but it does sound like they are figuring it out at Newark, at least. But I can tell you that part of the reason for the failure of the primary line was due to the fact that that line was made out of copper wiring. That's the type of wiring that transmits information from the radars to the air traffic control. And that was an issue that Congress was warned about last year. You may remember this sound clip from episode 310, which I titled Red Flags at Air Traffic Control. Here's Dean Acapelli. He's the chief of staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association. Here he was testifying to the Senate on December 12th of last year.
Currently, one of the highest priorities for the FAA is to address the outdated FAA Telecommunications Infrastructure Network, known as FTI. The FTI network affects radar displays that depict air traffic in real time and air-to-ground frequencies used to communicate with pilots. The network is largely comprised of copper wiring, which can no longer reliably meet the demand of the National Airspace System. Recently, ground stops at airports in the New York City and Washington, D.C. areas highlight the consequences of a failure of the FTI network. The FAA must transition 4,600 sites away from copper wire and onto fiber optic network to avoid extensive flight delays.
So this is not a new problem, and it's not isolated to Newark, New Jersey, which is also proven by the fact that as I was writing this episode at 1:50 p.m. on Monday, May 12th, the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center lost communication with pilots for, again, about 90 seconds. And since this just happened, I can't tell you anything about why it happened. All I know right now is that when the transmitters went down, air traffic controllers used another frequency to communicate instructions to pilots, according to FAA officials. And even though this Denver incident happened 2 days before the May 14th Senate hearing with FAA officials that you just heard some testimony from, the Denver incident wasn't discussed in the May 14th Senate hearing because the FAA didn't tell us that this happened until the day after the hearing, which was 3 days after the Denver equipment failure. And that was only after Denver 7, a local TV station, reported the communications equipment failure first. And so I don't love the 3-day silence about this. And it does make me wonder, if Denver 7 hadn't broken the story, would we have been told about this at all? And if that's a concern, have there been other incidents that we don't even know about? And I obviously can't answer that question. All I know is that it appears right now that the Denver outage seems to be a similar situation to what happened in Newark, in that the primary frequency stopped working and the backup failed to kick in. But everyone involved says that passengers were never truly in danger because air traffic control had other ways to communicate with pilots. And Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy, who was confirmed for the job on the day before the January crash, So the blame being placed on him for all of this, I've got to tell you, it's simply unfair. But I am happy to see that he is already committed to make transitioning the wires from copper to fiber optic wires a top priority. And I know that the FAA reauthorization law gave him the permission and funding he needs to do it. And I will say this about Sean Duffy. Sean Duffy was a congressman while I was producing this podcast. I've seen him in hearings and I have read his legislation. He is not a moron, despite his resume hilariously containing a season on Real World Boston. And so let's give the real world guy a chance. Because so far he's been saying everything that I would want to hear from the Secretary of Transportation in the wake of these incidents. And he hasn't been in charge long enough to be blamed for technical issues that Congress has been warned about for years. But as for the air traffic controller outages, clearly we need to know more. And the good news is that the National Transportation Safety Board is investigating, which means I know we will get real answers from them soon. And so let's move on, because I have nothing else to tell you about that. Let's move on to the investigation that the NTSB has had time to do. And that's the investigation into the crash between the American Airlines passenger plane and the military helicopter that killed 67 people just outside of the Washington, D.C. airport on January 29th. Now, that crash happened a little before 9 p.m. And in the wake of that crash, and in the episode I produced right after it, in episode 310, Red Flags at Air Traffic Control, there were questions about whether short staffing in the air traffic control tower at Reagan National Washington Airport may have played a role in the crash. Because I remember vividly hearing that at the time of that crash that evening, that there may have been only one air traffic controller working at that time. And so here's Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina, who clearly heard the same rumors. Here he is in a House Appropriations Committee oversight hearing on March 26th, asking NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady, who is one of the most competent and impressive people on our government, about that widely circulated rumor.
Is it true there was only one at the time?
No, there were 5 at the time in the tower. There were 9 on duty. What you might be referring to is the combining of positions. There were 6 at one point during the day before 3:40 p.m., where actually could have been 7, because they combined the position for clearance delivery and flight data, which is not uncommon, but they did combine positions for the helicopter position and the local traffic position into one. The person didn't leave, so it went down to 5 controllers at the time of the accident. That combined position was at 3:40 p.m. It stayed that way. The person went on break, came back into rotation at 4:27 p.m. But in total, there were 9 people on duty that day.
There were 9 people in the tower? I'm not talking about
5 in the cab.
at the time of the accident.
Correct.
Okay.
So the staffing that night was not as short as many of us believed. But still, after the crash, the Federal Aviation Administration made some changes at Reagan National Airport to help air traffic controllers. Here's Chris Rushlow, the acting administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, speaking to Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas on March 27th in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation.
So in the aftermath, we reduced the rate, the arrival rate. A lot of that was to support the NTSB ongoing investigation and the emergency response work. Today, we are running at what we call a 30 rate, so 30 arrivals an hour. And we're doing that largely in partnership. I mean, we received great information from the NTSB regarding some feedback they were receiving during their preliminary investigation regarding the workload on the controllers themselves. Obviously, the tragic event has an effect. I mean, these people come to work every day. They care about what they do. And so we reduced the rate down to 26. Slowly, we move back to now we're at 30 rate.
And will that stay constant or change in the future?
So that right now, that's constant. That's staying. We're continuing to monitor that.
For the foreseeable future, the 30, yes, is it 32? 30?
It can go to 32, but right now we're at 30, and we plan to maintain that until such time as we assess the safety and being able to go to a higher rate.
And I find this significant because Congress itself increased the arrival rate at that exact airport, and I'm still pissed about it. Because last year, there was a standalone bill in the House of Representatives that failed. It failed. That would have allowed 5 additional planes per day to land at the already too busy Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., which is an airport used all the time by members of Congress trying to get to and from their home districts. And that bill, I must emphasize, it failed. But that bill that failed became law anyway, when it got attached as a dingleberry by Republicans to the FAA reauthorization that became law in May of 2024. And those additional flights were added to the schedule just weeks before the helicopter and the plane crashed in January. And now flights are being removed from the schedule because 67 people died. This is such a perfect example of why legislating by dingleberry is dangerous. But anyway, the main issue with the number of flights allowed is the workload of air traffic controllers. And this is another issue that Congress has been warned about for many years before this crash. And so what is the FAA right now doing about it? Here's Chris Rushlow, the acting administrator of the FAA.
Right now, we have over 10,750 controllers on the job, with over 3,000 in training. We intend to hire another 2,000 controllers this year. We have streamlined the hiring process and incentivized hiring with a 30% increase in the salary of those who qualify to attend the FAA's academy. And we're already seeing positive results from these improvements. During the hiring surge that closed last week, we received over 10,000 applications, and more than 8,000 of those were referred to testing.
And so the lesson to take away from this is that the Trump administration's Federal Aviation Administration is not cutting air traffic controllers. They're hiring them. And I consider that to be excellent news. And so now let's get into the crash itself, starting first with where the NTSB is in the investigation process as of the end of March. Here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Investigations take time. We have a lot of work to do in this investigation, from interviews to analyses of large volumes of documents and data to review, to air carrier operations that we have to review, helicopter operations, air traffic control, human performance, helicopter airworthiness, flight recorders, and more. In total, we have about 40 NTSB experts leading this investigation in collaboration with the parties and others, and we're aiming to complete this investigation within 1 year.
And so what exactly has already been completed and is being talked about in these hearings in Congress?
On March 11th, we released our preliminary report, which contains only factual information that we've gathered in the first few weeks, all of which can change throughout the course of the investigation. It doesn't include analysis or findings, nor does it determine probable cause. Those will be in our final report.
And so, according to the preliminary report, full of facts, at 8:48 p.m. on the night of January 29th, an Army helicopter, which you will hear referred to as PAT 25, it was conducting a training flight along the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And here's what they were training for. Here's Matthew Brayman. He is the director of Army Aviation.
For context, PAT 25's unit, the 12th Aviation Battalion, falls under the Army Aviation Brigade, or referred to as the TAB. And that unit has the mission to provide continuous, responsive aviation support to senior military and government leaders to enable continuity of government operations and defense support to civil authorities.
So PAT 25 was part of the Army unit that flies the bigwigs around. Well, PAT 25, with no bigwigs on board, was flying along the Potomac River because they were testing one of the pilots on their ability to fly with night vision goggles. At the same time, an American Airlines flight, 5342, which you will hear referred to as the CRJ, well, that plane was approaching the airport to land on runway 33 at the airport. Reading through the report, and admittedly, I'm not an expert in aviation terminology, and so we will need to wait for the final report to make sure that what I'm about to say is true. But it appears that everything was pretty normal in terms of Flight 5342. The helicopter is where the problems appeared to be. Because at 8:45 p.m., 3 minutes before the crash, the helicopter crew was told that their elevation was too high. They were at 300 feet, and they were told they needed to get down to 200. 1 minute later, air traffic control told the helicopter that Flight 5342 was circling to runway 33. But the recording indicates that the helicopter crew probably didn't hear the word circling for whatever reason. About 20 seconds before the crash, an alert was heard inside of Flight 5342's cockpit from the CRJ airplane's collision avoidance system. At this point, the helicopter and the plane were less than a mile apart from one another. 17 seconds before the crash, air traffic control told the helicopter to, quote, pass behind the CRJ, unquote. But recordings indicated that the helicopter crew probably didn't hear the pass behind the part of that message. In response, the helicopter pilot said that they could see the airplane, requesting visual separation, which they were given. Then, 1 second before the crash, the airplane started to fly upwards. Now, the report doesn't say this, but that does seem to indicate to me that the airplane pilots were aware of the helicopter at this point and tried to abort the landing by pulling the airplane up. But the helicopter's pitch, that remained steady. And then they crashed. And so knowing that, especially the part about the Black Hawk military helicopter being told that it was flying too high and needed to descend, here's a question posed by Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina to NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy.
On page 9 of the preliminary report, it states that the MPFR, the multi-purpose flight recorder's reading for pressure altitude, conflicted with other altitudes readings. Ultimately, this conflict led your team to invalidate the pressure altitude reading provided by the recorder. Can you provide any details on the differing altitude readings? And do you have any update on whether this conflicting data was limited to the MPFR or if that was provided to the flight crew and perhaps was a confusing factor?
We are still looking into that and doing some testing. What I will say is the pressure altitude was determined invalid on the Black Hawk because we would expect that to be somewhat similar to the CRJ, but it was much lower. So we determined that that was invalid and it couldn't be used to calculate the barometric altitude. We would need two sets of data, which is pressure altitude and barometric pressure setting. We had the pressure setting. We don't have the pressure pressure altitude data for that. So we can't, we were not able to determine from that what the barometric altitude was of the Black Hawk. However, we are looking at other data.
And reading the report, they don't know right now if that problem with the altitude data was just on the recorder or if it was a problem that could have affected the altitude information inside the helicopter cockpit. But this makes me wonder if the helicopter crew even knew what their actual altitude was. Either way, though, what's clear is that something was wrong with the altitude-related equipment on that helicopter. And there was another issue with the helicopter's equipment, but this issue was more sinister because the equipment's failure to prevent this crash was by choice. And so for the next while, we are going to be listening to testimony about a system nicknamed ADS-B. And so let's take a second to make sure we all know what that is. So ADS-B stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. And this is the standard surveillance system for the majority of the world's aviation industry right now. ADS-B uses GPS satellite signals to provide air traffic controllers and pilots with accurate information to help keep aircraft safely separated in the sky and on the runways. And there are two kinds of ADS-B broadcasts, ADS-B in and ADS-B out. ADS-B in allows an aircraft to receive the location, speed, altitude, and other data from other aircraft. ADS-B out on an aircraft broadcasts that aircraft's location, altitude, speed, and other data to other aircraft and to air traffic control. As of 2020, installation of ADS-B out equipment is mandatory for aircraft flying through the airspace in the United States, Europe, Canada, and much of Asia and the Pacific Islands. But use of ADS-B out here in the United States is mandatory only on most aircraft in the United States. And the reason that it's mandatory on most and not all aircraft is because of the first Trump administration. That's because in 2010, the FAA under the Obama administration had issued a final regulation to require all aircraft to be equipped with ADS-B out and to operate with it on at all times. But in 2019, shortly before that regulation went into effect, the FAA under the Trump administration weakened the rule, adding exceptions for some government agencies, including the military, which, by the way, is a change they made without public notice or comments allowed. But at the time, the FAA, in response to the weakened regulations created by the first Trump administration, the FAA issued a warning. They said, quote, FAA anticipates that non-transmission of ADS-B out will not be routinely used by agencies that have been granted this relief, unquote. And for reasons that I cannot tell you because I am baffled, ADS-B in is not required for anyone, even though a study conducted using 4 years worth of data confirmed that accident rates were reduced by 40 to 60% for aircraft equipped with ADS-B in. But since the location of the PAT-25 military Black Hawk helicopter, which is clearly the aircraft that was in a location where it wasn't supposed to be during the crash, well, since the helicopter's location is a main focus of the investigation, the equipment that broadcasts its location was a main topic of conversation in the hearings. And so here's what we learned about what was going on in the cockpit of that helicopter. Here's Matthew Brayman. He is the director of Army Aviation.
PAT-25 was operating out of Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir. The crew of 3 were fully qualified to fly in the local area. The pilot in command, CW2 Andrew Eaves, was an instructor pilot. The co-pilot, Captain Rebecca Lobach, was a qualified pilot in command as well. And the crew chief, Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, was a standardization flight instructor. The night of 29 January, PAT-25 was conducting an annual proficiency and readiness test, or APART. And as part of that flight, was approved to operate at contingency locations associated with their directed mission. This has led to questions as to whether PAT-25 was transmitting automatic dependent surveillance broadcast out, or ADS-B out. The specific status of both its operation and functionality is something that is under the investigation of the NTSB. The crew, however, was approved to operate with that capability off in accordance with Army policy.
And so even though there was no bigwig in that helicopter, and therefore no logical reason for the helicopter's exact location to need to be a secret, the military allowed that training mission to be flown without ADS-B out working, and therefore transmuting its location to other aircraft and air traffic control. And so Senator Ted Cruz of Texas asked the questions that I was hoping someone would ask, which boiled down to why? How is the military determining which missions can be flown without this critical location transmission broadcast system turned on? So here's Matthew Brayman, the director of Army Aviation, talking to Senator Cruz.
The Army has a memo, August 9th, 2024, entitled ADS-B Out Off Operations in the National Airspace. My staff requested that memo from you, and my understanding is your team declined to provide it. That is also unacceptable. I want to ask you at this hearing, will you commit to providing that memo to this committee?
Senator, I'll commit to reviewing the information and getting what we can to you. Absolutely.
That answer needs to be a yes, that you will provide that memo to this committee.
Senator, we'll review that and we'll look at the ability to give it to the committee. Absolutely.
So not only is the military doing whatever the hell it wants in regards to turning on and off their communications equipment, the military won't even tell Congress how they make those determinations. But that's not even the worst part. Here's Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas speaking to Jennifer Homendy of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Since the report that we're discussing here today is 2 weeks old, what has transpired, if anything, in those 2 weeks? Have you discovered any new and relevant information that you can share with us?
Where would you like me to begin? One thing I can say on ADS-B out off, that's policy of the Army, but we are also still looking at installation programming and potential for equipment malfunction. And the reason I mention this is because the accident helicopter, for this accident helicopter, no ADS-B data had been received from an FAA ground station for 730 days. prior to the accident. And that was abnormal. So we began looking at the fleet for the battalion. The battalion had 25 helicopters. That includes this particular helicopter. 9 of them were Mike models, and all were transmitting ADS-B out when they were turned on, because we have to verify that it's working. There were 16 Limas, including the accident helicopter, which we're still looking at, but 7 were transmitting when ADS-B out was turned on. 8 were not, and stopped doing so sometime between May and November 2023. We don't know why. 5 of those started transmitting since the NTSB identified the issue and began working with the Army to try to isolate the reason. So I just want to let you know that you can have ADS-B out on, but you also have to make sure that it's working.
The helicopter that crashed hadn't broadcast their location at all using ADS-B out since mid-2023. The military uses that equipment so infrequently that unit didn't even seem to care if the equipment even worked. And here's some more proof of that being true. Here's Senator Ted Cruz again speaking to Matthew Briney, the Director of Army Aviation.
How frequently does the Army turn off ADS-B out transmission?
Chairman Cruz, as I stated in the discussion about how we approve the missions, a mission would have to fall into the category as defined in the federal regulation and Army policy. It must have national security implications and be sensitive in nature to be able to do that mission.
General, you're not answering my question. My question is, how frequently is ADS-B out turned off? I wasn't asking what the standard is. I was asking the frequency.
I can take the number for record, Senator, but I can tell you the types of missions and the majority of the missions they fly are missions associated with that national security mission.
Is it accurate that ADS-B out is turned off for 100% of missions flown by the Army Air Brigade at Fort Belvoir?
Senator, I think you're referring to the June 8th letter from the Joint Staff to Representative Norton. In the context of missions, meaning the things, the operations that the 12th Aviation supports in their mission requirements, I would say that's an accurate statement. I would not say that's an accurate statement of 100% of the flights being flown by that organization.
Okay, so I want to understand what you mean by missions. Does missions capture training flights?
Only training flights that would have been operating in a location that's sensitive as part of their continuity of government operations.
Well, that would be all of them around DCA, is that correct?
Only specific sites that are part of that continuity of government operation.
In your one-pager, you said 75% of the flights are mission rehearsal readiness flights. Are those operated with ADS-B out?
They are, Senator, yes.
So right now, today, the Army is flying helicopters in and around DCA Airport with ADS-B out turned off. Is that correct?
When conducting their NORTHCOM directed mission, that is correct.
And this Army general, while admitting that they allow Army helicopters to keep ADS-B out off literally all of the time, they seem to think that this should make us all feel better. Here's General Matthew Briney, the Director of Army Aviation.
The aircraft transponder, however, was active with Mode 3 Alpha Charlie and Mode S when within the Class B airspace and was emitting all the required information to allow air traffic services and traffic collision avoidance systems to detect and track the aircraft. Army policy does not permit transponder off operations in the national airspace. They do not permit transponder off operations.
2 problems with that. 1, the information transmitted by a transponder is much less detailed than the information transmitted to a nearby aircraft and to air traffic control by ADS-B out. Instead of providing GPS location and altitude and speed, a transponder only transmits altitude. And so, 2, that does fuck all for safety when the altitude readings on the helicopter are wrong. And so what is the FAA, the airplane police, doing about this now that it's clear that the military is not maintaining its equipment, nor even trying to use it most of the time? Here's Chris Richelieu, the acting administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration.
And all aircraft operating in DCA Class B airspace will be required to broadcast their position and identification using ADS-B out, with very limited exceptions.
But that sounds exactly like the situation we were already in. It's the exceptions that allow the military and other agencies to make their own decisions about whether or not to use ADS-B out. Those exceptions are the problem. And so the FAA, based on that testimony, it doesn't sound like they've changed much. And so what is the military committed to do since the crash? Here's General Matthew Briney, the director of Army Aviation.
So in the occurrence of things like ADS-B out operations, that authority resides with a medium risk authority. So a battalion commander must approve that mission in particular. And in this case, the policy allowed that to be delegated down to a company commander. And they must approve that it meets the standards of the policy completely. We have now elevated that risk to high risk. That requires an 06 commander to approve any mission that has ADS-B off.
That is not even close to good enough. Because I don't care who approves of it. The policy is clearly that these helicopters almost never have to turn ADS-B out on. That's the problem. Not which asshole in a uniform gives that behavior the thumbs up. And Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington, she understood the assignment in her questions to acting FAA Administrator Chris Richelieu after she was told this by Director of Army Aviation, General Matthew Briney.
Army policy is ADS-B out is not to be used for routine use.
Okay. So, acting administrator, did you know this? Did the FAA know this? Did the FAA know and understand and absorb this? Did you know that you were allowing a flight to go within 75 feet of each other and there was no signaling message that we have already identified as a safety measure is something that we have had as a requirement?
So I understand the FAA was aware of this. We have an existing memorandum of agreement with the Department of Defense.
Did you know it was 100% as the Eleanor Holmes Norton and as the Brigadier General is pretty clear this morning, we don't allow it, even to the point of not answering Senator Cruz when they're going to change it, because I'm pretty sure their attitude is going to be, we don't allow it. He's going to say he would rather have a route somewhere where he can fly without it. That's what he's going to say. And so, you know, that's a separate issue over here. Our job, though, is the FAA oversight, and you can't give exemptions to things that you don't understand. And so he, in their application, kind of made it sound like, well, it's not going to be that routine, but he's very clear. They're never turning it on if they don't have to. They're never turning it on. So what I don't understand is why the FAA didn't understand that. Why you would allow this design. This is the wrong design. Whoever said you could fly in this airspace this close together without a safety feature that was already being required by the FAA and then giving them an exemption makes no sense. So why did you allow it to happen?
So I can't speak to why the previous administration may have allowed for that memorandum of agreement, which is why we, effective today, will require in any DCA Class B airspace, ADS-B out to be turned on, except in very limited circumstances.
What are those other limited circumstances?
So that
other agencies? Is there any other agency that's doing this?
So that we have 46 different helicopter operators within the National Capital Region. But again, DCA Class B airspace will now require ADS-B on to be out.
What other agencies are operating this way?
So we have certainly a number of military units. We have local law enforcement. We certainly have the Department of Justice and FBI. We have a number of different agencies that fly the Park Police. And those are the entities that we're working with closely now to make sure, first and foremost, they understand the new restrictions that we have in the airspace.
Do they have exemptions?
Some of them do.
Are you concerned about this?
Absolutely, which is why we immediately put in place the requirement to have ADS-B out on.
And so you think they're operating that way?
Yes, ma'am.
You think that Homeland Security is operating that way?
They are operating, effective today, they will be operating with ADSB.
Effective today?
Yes, ma'am.
So for the last month, you've known, as I am going to submit for the record, a letter from the Department of Homeland Security that basically says, under the federal aviation waiver, all U.S. Custom and Border Protection, air and marine operations in the capital region basically have this exemption as well.
So
And
they haven't had.
So I want to understand, if people were
Sure.
still flying in this airspace, we all fly in and out of this airspace.
Right.
Do we now have to worry about other operators in this airspace that may be doing the same thing as happened with the military?
So
And
I
now
should-
you're telling me you're going to take action today.
I should clarify, immediately after the accident, we put the restrictions in place so that no mixed traffic could occur. No helicopters and fixed wing in the same airspace. Today, we're requiring the ADSB out to be on. So previous to this day, the fixed wing as well as helicopters were not allowed in the airspace. So we cleared the complexity of that airspace.
Now today, you're going to say to Homeland Security, you have to have ADBS, basically the automatic surveillance broadcast system has to be on. You're going to make that today.
That's correct.
And this was an excellent follow-up question by Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas.
Before recognizing Senator Budd, does the FAA, Mr. Rushlow, does it have the authority to supersede the operations of the Army and these other agencies in the airspace around airports? We haven't gotten the Army to say they're going to do this with their own policy, but you say you're mandating it. Do we know that the Army and others have to follow your mandate?
Yes, sir, they do.
And so if this enforcement decision by the FAA holds, this would be an improvement. But I would definitely like to see this requirement to keep ADSB out on. I'd like to see that requirement be put into writing, because the exemptions that allow the military and DHS and all those other agencies that were listed to fly around with this communications equipment off, those exemptions are written in a memorandum of understanding. But so far as I know, the new requirements that this equipment has to be on, which were enacted during the hearing, as far as I know, those requirements are not in writing. And of course, the damn equipment has to be functional. Here's Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois speaking to Chris Lushlow, the acting administrator of the FAA.
You're not looking at the other operators because they're not part of this accident, correct? So then my question for Mr. Rushlow is, will you be will the FAA be directing all of the other helicopter operators, whether it's Homeland Security, local law enforcement, who have this exemption to ADSB out, will you be directing that they actually test their equipment to make sure that it is actually transmitting the data that can be received?
Yes, Senator. I think that's part of our ongoing work in the collaboration between those operators and how we make sure they, first and foremost, understand the requirement, and second, that their equipment is functional.
Okay, thank you.
But once again, I'm not interested in a collaboration. I want the FAA to tell these agencies what they need to do. Collaboration tells me that they're working in some kind of partnership. I want the police to say, this is what you must do. And then finally, even if the FAA decides to finally force every aircraft, regardless of bigwig passengers, to use the safety equipment that broadcasts its precise location to air traffic control around airports, and even if that equipment is routinely checked to make sure that it works, there is one last issue with ADSB. Most of this testimony has been about ADSB out. But here's a reality about the night of the crash. Here's NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy.
The CRJ had ADSB out. It did not have ADSB in. And so we are going to look at what that information could have provided to that flight crew and how it could have made a difference. We've seen that in other investigations, which is why we have these recommendations.
What is the point of making every aircraft transmit data if the other aircraft are not required to receive it, or even to give themselves the ability to receive it? And so why hasn't this been required? Well, that was a question asked by Representative Steve Womack of Arkansas to Jennifer Homendy of the NTSB.
What are the various, and I'll use the word excuses, but what are the various reasons why many of the things that are recommended by the NTSB never find their way into certain protocols.
Sometimes they'll use cost. That they'll say the cost is not justified by the benefits. I will say one thing that we're looking at as part of this investigation is ADS-B out and ADS-B in. ADS-B out is required for commercial aircraft and has been since 2020, but ADS-B in is not required. We've been on record since 2008 that ADS-B in should be mandated, but the FAA has used cost as a reason not to mandate that. What that would have done or could have done, and we'll look at that as part of this investigation, is the CRJ, the plane, had ADS-B out. It did not have ADS-B in, though American does have some Airbus planes that do have ADS-B in that could have provided them some information about the helicopter positioning and flight path. But that information was not available to them.
And I find that absolutely tragic, that this has been a recommendation since 2008, and 67 people are dead. Unbelievable. And so now that we've looked at the issues with the helicopter involved in the crash and the equipment on the CRJ, which was missing, which could have maybe helped, although probably not, since the helicopter wasn't transmitting out that information anyway. Whatever. Now that we've looked into that, and the military, whose relaxed attitudes towards safety likely contributed to that crash, let's now take a look at the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, which, if you haven't been there, it's in a pretty insane location. Because that airport is basically in downtown Washington, D.C. When you land at Reagan National, or DCA, when you land there and you're sitting on the right side of the plane most of the time, but most of the time, if you're on the right side of the plane, you look out the window and you can see all the sights. You can see the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument and the White House. It's all right there, right across the river. And if you're taking off and sitting on the left side of the plane, you can see the Pentagon, which is essentially next door to the airport. It is truly bonkers how crowded that airspace is. And so here's what's happening there. Here's Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Yes, and what we did is we looked at FAA surveillance data and then voluntary reporting system data. So that's reporting from pilots, reporting from air traffic control. Those are voluntary reporting systems. And then there's a mandatory reporting system for occurrences in air traffic control. And what the data showed us is that there were 15,214 close proximity events from 2021 through 2024 at DCA between helicopters and planes. 15,214 close proximity events. That doesn't mean that they were near collisions, but close proximity events where the vertical and lateral separation was too small of a margin.
Yeah.
I think what is most alarming to me, well, two things, that you had reporting over years. In fact, there was reporting there was data going back to 2011 that traffic collision alerts were going off monthly as a result of close proximity to helicopters, and that's from 2011 through 2024. And so for me, all this data is being collected by FAA from operators, from others, from voluntary reporting systems. Where is that data going to trend potential accidents and incidents in the future? The next accident is in the data right now. And what are we doing to figure out what that is? There does seem to be an issue with identifying emerging trends and looking at, there's a lot of data going to FAA and taking that data and looking at trends and not specific issues, I think is something not only the IG has raised, but others have raised, even the acting administrator has raised about having to do a better job with analyzing those trends. But it's key, because if we can get it after an accident occurs, what's key is getting it before and preventing it.
And so, now that we know this, what is the Federal Aviation Administration doing? Here's Chris Rushlow, the acting administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration.
There's an ongoing review all the time of the data that is available. As the chair mentioned, there's millions of pieces of data that come in, and I would tell you that we have verified every single near mid-air collision was investigated, but there are certainly those instances where the information itself was not identified, and that's why we've put artificial intelligence and machine learning in place now to ensure that we're able to go through millions and millions, tens of millions of pieces of data to identify those trends and act quickly to mitigate those risks.
Which, even though I have my own issues with AI technology where it is now, as someone who uses ChatGPT and knows how often it's wrong, I do think it's better than the nothing they were doing to spot trends up until, well, now. And I also think that we need to know that this analysis is not just being done in regards to the Washington, D.C. airport. There are concerns about other airports as well.
We have 10 locations around the United States, including Alaska, Anchorage, that we're looking through right now, what we are referring to as hotspots, to look at similar trends, similar activities as it relates to fixed wing and helicopter operations. We're looking at hotspots or mixed traffic areas around the nation, whether that's Boston, Dallas, LA, and Anchorage.
So Washington, D.C., Anchorage, Boston, Dallas, Los Angeles. That's half of the 10 hotspots. I don't know where the other 5 are. But back to the D.C. airport, here's Jennifer Homendy of the NTSB.
The other most alarming to me is how nobody figured out, based on the glide slope going into runway 33, that if you look at the helicopter route, that there's only 75 feet of separation between a plane coming in to runway 33 max. That's 75 feet max. That route doesn't have lateral boundaries. And in fact, in this case, the helicopter was to the right of the route. So it's a very small margin for error. But we don't wait for a final report to take action. If we uncover critical safety issues that require immediate attention, which is why, in conjunction with the release of our preliminary report, we also issued 2 urgent safety recommendations to the FAA. In both reports, we cited FAA surveillance data that showed between October 2021 and December 2024, there were over 15,000 close proximity events between commercial aircraft and helicopters at DCA. In reviewing that and other data, including airport operations and established helicopter routes, we determined that the separation distances between helicopter traffic operating on Route 4 and aircraft using runways 15 and 33 are insufficient and pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety. As a result, we recommended that the FAA prohibit operations on helicopter Route 4 between Haines Point and Wilson Bridge when those runways are being used for departures and arrivals. We also recommended that the FAA designate an alternative helicopter route that can be used to facilitate travel between Haines Point and the Wilson Bridge when that segment of Route 4 is closed.
And so in response to those recommendations, here's what the FAA did.
The recommendations align with the actions the FAA took under Secretary Duffy's leadership immediately following the accident to restrict helicopter operations around DCA, eliminating mixed helicopter and fixed-wing traffic, and carefully developing alternative routes. Following the NTSB recommendations, the FAA took action to make these restrictions permanent. When essential helicopter operations, such as life-saving medical, active law enforcement, active air defense, or presidential transport must operate in the flight-restricted airspace, fixed-wing aircraft are not allowed in that airspace.
And I'm happy to tell you, or to show you, that the military doesn't seem to be fighting these changes. Here's Brigadier General, and I'm sorry to the military people that I haven't been saying Brigadier General the entire time, because I didn't realize he was a brigadier general until halfway through this episode. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I promise. But here is Brigadier General Matthew Briney, who is the director of Army Aviation. He is being questioned by Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina.
Can the Army continue to fulfill its priority air transport missions without access to Route 1 and Route 4?
The Army is certainly, the fact that we're in the working groups will allow us to help influence routing that will allow us to continue to do that mission. I'm confident we can do that.
And on top of that, on March 27th, the military also told Congress that they were cooperating in this way. Here's Brigadier General Matthew Briney, Director of Army Aviation.
But where prudent, the Army is not waiting to take action. Immediately after the accident, the 12th Aviation Battalion paused all operations. They've only recently resumed flights and only outside the 7 nautical mile radius of DCA, with the exception of flights directly supporting the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and that remains true today.
But less than a month after his testimony, here's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas this week on May 14th in a conversation with Franklin McIntosh, the Deputy Chief Operating Officer at the FAA's Air Traffic Control Organization.
On April 25th, for the first time since the January 28 mid-air collision, the Army resumed flying in the National Capital Region. Less than a week later, Air Traffic Control had to command 2 commercial aircraft on final approach to abort their landing at DCA due to an Army Black Hawk on an apparent training mission at the Pentagon having wandered far too close to the commercial aircraft flight path. Shortly thereafter, and just 10 days after having resumed limited flight in the National Capital Region, the Army Aviation Brigade suspended operations in the D.C. area. Mr. McIntosh, I've been told that prior to the Army Aviation Brigade's decision to suspend operations on May 5th, the FAA was preparing to suspend the letter of agreement between the Army and the FAA that gives the Army the ability to operate the D.C. airspace without having to first ask for FAA clearance for each flight. Was the FAA prepared to suspend the letter of agreement? And if so, what was concerning enough to justify such a decision?
Thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. Like yourself, we were extremely troubled by the incident that occurred, especially in light of DCA and the events that led up to the accident. To be quite honest with you, we were ready to deploy any option available that we could use or had that we felt was necessary to bring safety measures and better behaviors from the DoD in this instance. To answer your question, we were ready to do any option available to include what you just spoke to, which was removing the ability to fly.
So just to be clear, does that mean the FAA did actually draft an order suspending the Army's ability to fly in the D.C. area?
I'm not 100% aware if we drafted an order, sir, but we did have discussions if that was an option that we wanted to pursue. I do know that the DoD came back and suspended operations on their own based on that event. So we're still working with DoD to improve that process.
And I'm curious, since the military, after suspending their helicopter operations after the crash, then decided themselves when they can fly again, I'm curious if they will be able to decide when to fly again this time too, since the FAA merely had discussions as opposed to issuing an actual regulation, an actual order. Like, oh, the military policed themselves, so we're all good. Well, we weren't all good the last time, which allowed this to happen.
You had an aircraft that you did not give a landing clearance to, or that aircraft aborted the landing, whatever occurred. That aircraft went back and entered Class Bravo airspace. That aircraft is not supposed to enter Class Bravo airspace without permission of air traffic control. That did not occur. My question, and I think the larger question is why did that not occur? Without compliance to our procedures and our policies, this is where safety drift starts to happen. And that's where my line of question is starting, is absent, even if absent a published go-around procedure, if we want to call it that, pilots and controllers have shared responsibilities. You do not enter Class Bravo airspace without authorization from air traffic control, and that is a question that we are asking.
But a question I'm asking is, why would the military feel any pressure at all to comply with the spoken rules created by the airplane police that have so far proven to be incredibly lenient. It seems to me that the military is flying how and where they want to because they can. Because despite the deaths of 67 people, there have been almost no additional requirements placed upon them in writing. So much of what we are hearing has been voluntary actions by a military that keeps proving itself incapable of policing itself in a way that puts our safety first. And here's yet another example of that was brought to light in the hearing that happened this week on May 14th in the Senate. Here's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas speaking to Franklin McIntosh, who is the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of the Air Traffic Organization at the FAA.
Is it true that the hotline, the direct line between the Pentagon Air Traffic Control and the DCA tower, has been inoperable since March of 2022?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Who maintains that hotline?
I believe the DoD maintains that hotline, but I think the next question would be, why were we not aware of it and insist upon it being fixed? And
I didn't have that written down, but it's a good one.
Well, so we take safety responsibilities extremely seriously in the FAA, and those were the questions we were asking. And we were not aware, but we became aware after that event. And now that we became aware of that event, we're insisting upon that line to be fixed before we resume any operations out of the Pentagon.
Do you have a timeline for when that line will be operational?
To be honest with you, Senator, I would expect the DoD to expedite that timeline so they can begin their operations.
And while Army flights were ongoing, if the hotline was not operational, how did controllers communicate?
That's a great question, Senator. We still have landline abilities. We can make phone calls from the helipad to the operation where the supervisor or even the controller in charge can answer. So we're aware of the activity. And if there was a departure clearance needed, we'd be able to relay it via that mechanism.
So the military is supposed to maintain that hotline, and they didn't. And when the FAA found out, they trust the military to fix it. And the FAA didn't even require the military to give them a timeline. And in the meantime, they're using landline phone calls like we're in the 1980s. And so that's yet another example of our aviation system using technology so old that only senior living facilities still use it. And so, in conclusion, we all know, especially listeners to this show, and we've known for a long time, that our aviation system equipment needs upgrading. And even the Trump administration, under the real-world Boston guy's leadership at the Transportation Department, is aware of it and seems poised to take action, especially in the wake of the communications outages at Newark and Denver. But my main takeaways from these hearings about the January crash are two things that aren't being discussed nearly enough in the national conversation. One, the military is being given way too much freedom to do whatever the fuck they want. We have known this for a long time outside the United States, but the lack of oversight is putting Americans here at home in danger as well. And two, the FAA, even after the crash, is still not fully willing to police the military. Yes, the military helicopters are grounded again after more near misses at Reagan National Airport. But that's because the military made a voluntary decision to do so, which means the military still has the power to put those helicopters back in the sky with whatever procedures they decide whenever they want. We need the FAA to police them. The FAA needs to tell the military, not ask the military, tell the military what routes they are allowed to use. The FAA needs to tell the military when and how its equipment must be maintained, since they have proven that they are not making sure their equipment is functional on their own. The FAA needs to get rid of the written exceptions to using safety equipment granted during the first Trump administration. These need to be gotten rid of in writing and not temporarily while Congress and the public is watching. This needs to be a real-ass regulation, because otherwise we are trading the safety of you and I and everyone who flies on airplanes for unnecessary secrecy of the military and the Department of Homeland Security and other government agencies who exist, at least in theory, to protect us from harm. And so trading safety for secrecy, that is not a trade that I'm willing to make. And the FAA needs to step up and police the military in order to stop that trade from continuing to happen. The military has already proven that they will not adequately police themselves and prioritize our safety. And since the FAA has proven over and over again its unwillingness, going back many administrations in both parties, since the FAA has proven its unwillingness to police the military and businesses, like we've already done a bunch of episodes about all the shit that Boeing's been able to get away with. Since the FAA is proving itself unwilling to strictly police, Congress needs to force it to do its job, which they can do via funding laws. And the good news is that members of both parties right now are pissed about the FAA allowing all of this to happen. Because, the person who asked the best questions and who was the toughest in both of these Senate hearings was Republican Senator Ted Cruz. And so right now, in this moment, this is not a lost cause. But our members of Congress need to know that we are aware of the issues with the military and the FAA, which means we need to tell them that we are watching and that we want the military to be told what to do. No more voluntary, we need mandatory. And so the phone number you need to call if you want to make your voice heard and help with this is 202-224-3121. That's the Congressional switchboard, and they can connect you to your member of the House of Representatives and your 2 senators. But finally, here's a reminder, because I know that this episode, I know it made me uncomfortable hearing about what's going on in our skies. But despite this information being pretty scary, when it comes to transportation in the United States, here's the reality. This is a reminder from Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board.
What I will say, and I know there's been a lot of focus on aviation, our biggest contributor to fatalities right now in transportation is on our roads. Over 40,000 people are dying on our nation's roads every year, millions injured. You know, we talk about transportation accidents as single accidents, but every day, an average of 112 people are dying on our roads. 112 people, and we don't blink an eye. There is so much we have to do to improve road safety across the U.S., and we have so many recommendations on that. If we can get that number down, that would be significant. That's 95% of all transportation fatalities.
And so I hope this episode doesn't discourage you from flying, especially if the choice is between flying and driving, because it's still safer by far to fly than it is to drive. So keep flying those friendly skies. And let's just call our members of Congress to try to make those skies just a little bit safer. All right, so we're going to have an abrupt ending to this episode because we have no executive producers. If you don't know, executive producers are people that provide $535 for each of their executive producer credits. When you put a credit on an episode, it moves that episode up our most valuable episodes list, which makes it far more likely to be heard by people who are just now finding Congressional Dish. It is a roadmap for our newbies. But yeah, we have no EPs to announce today. So if you want a credit, you will definitely be announced on the next episode if you step up and apply for a credit today. All right. I would like to thank Claire, who is back to work doing her production and research assistant job. Thank you so much, Claire, for helping with this episode. Thank you, Mike, for editing all of my verbal mistakes. Mike works for Pro Podcast Solutions, which is the best outsourcing decision I ever made if you need an editor. I'd also like to thank Mark at podcastbranding.co, who does our web design and security. I'd like to thank my sister Lauren, who, she didn't have to do anything with executive producers for this episode, but usually when I announce them, it is because Lauren has processed their payments and made sure that I am aware of that. I'd also like to thank my dad and my stepmom, Robin, who recently finished my taxes. And of course, I'd like to thank Brian Karras, who is our guardian angel. Yeah, I like to think that he is now our ghost, giving us not a ghost, because I guess ghosts, those were people with unfinished business. But you know what? Brian does have unfinished business. He was our artist for a very long time, and we really don't function that well artistically without him. So I like to think that he is a ghost doing his unfinished business of providing our artwork through ChatGPT. So yeah, love you and miss you, Brian. All right, thanks for listening. I will talk to you soon, especially if you are listening on Patreon. I will talk to you even sooner on Last Week in Congress. So sign up on Patreon and you'll get all the dirt on Congress sooner than these public episodes. All right. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.